Well, let's have a bit more of a yarn about today's protests. We're joined in the studio by the President of the National Union of Students, Deanna Taylor, and from Melbourne we have Matthew Lesh. He's from the Australian Liberal Students Federation. To both of you, thank you very much for your time. Deanna, if we could start with you, why not reasoned dialogue on your concerns here instead of protests that disrupt the wider community?
The two things aren't mutually exclusive, and the National Union of Students certainly uses all sorts of forms of engagement and ways to affect policy change. One of those is protesting and hitting the streets, and we did that today, but that doesn't mean that we aren't going to be talking to as many crossbenchers as we possibly can to try and stop these measures passing through the Senate.
Deanna, how successful do you think those discussions will be with the crossbenchers?
Well, we've already seen Clive Palmer indicate his opposition to the deregulation of fees, which was very positive to see. Senator Nick Xenophon has also had some pretty good things to say from our perspective about the deregulation of fees and voicing his opposition, so far seems quite positive.
Matthew Lesh in Melbourne, do you agree and concede that protests are a time-tested form of airing grievances against decisions made by both sides of politics?
Look, I think the protests that we saw on the streets of our capital cities today were disgusting and unrepresentative. I mean, sure, these people have every right to protest, and I accept that in a free society. But violently confronting police, as what we saw, is not acceptable. It does a disservice to the national debate and the dialogue. And the reality is that the vast majority of students actually weren't on the streets today. They were students like me who were actually in class. And we've also seen even more violence in our campuses as the extreme left comes and protests people like Sophie Mirabella and Julie Bishop. You know, look, I challenge the Australian National Union of Students and Deanna Taylor on national television to say that these kind of violence against women is simply unacceptable.
Well, I'm not here to talk about particular instances that have occurred over the last couple of weeks. The key thing here is that it's not just a fringe group of students who are protesting against these measures. I'm sorry that you weren't able to participate today, Matthew, but overwhelmingly it's clear that students are opposed to these changes, and we had a range of students from all walks of life, all political persuasions coming out onto the streets today to show that they wouldn't stand for the government's plans.
Matthew said it's extreme left. He said that those who were out on the streets.
That's obviously not correct. I'm sure Matthew would like to frame it as if it's the extreme left, but the reality is that it wasn't, and we were also standing with the National Tertiary Education Union and a lot of other sector groups who have come out to oppose the deregulation of fees and other measures introduced under the budget.
Matthew Lesh, how would you approach this issue? How would you get the government to listen to your concerns if it's not through taking to the streets?
Look, I think we have to have a civilised political debate about what is a very difficult and complex educational reforms, but also at the same time necessary. I mean, I think these are very positive reforms. I think the fact that about 100,000 extra people will have access to the help debt system because it's going to be expanded to pre-bachelor, so to sub-bachelor level. It is a fantastic initiative. But I also think as students we have a responsibility to pay our way in education, at least a little bit more.
But Matthew, you must be able to understand that we're not talking about a small adjustment in the higher education system. We're talking about a fundamental shake-up that will see students paying exorbitant fees, and we will see fees skyrocket. We're talking 6 digits in the hundreds of thousands. And when you accept the fact that we already have the 6th highest fees in the OECD in Australia, I would argue, and I would hope that you would agree, that suggesting students aren't paying their fair share and need to be footing the bill more is just inaccurate and is really misleading the public.
Look, the reality is that we pay about 40% of our education, and we don't pay that until we actually start a job. Now, you and I are in a very privileged position. We have access to higher education. The majority of Australians don't have access to that.
And this government is going to see that continue, and they're going to see it worsen.
That's blatantly not true. I mean, we will earn over $1 million extra in our lifetime as a result of having higher education. Now, as a result of that, we have a responsibility.
You're going to earn more than me, I might
extra.
add, because of the gender pay gap.
Look, everyone has an opportunity in life given by education. I think that's very powerful. But also, in terms of access to education, there will be more places available under the help system. People who go to TAFE currently can't get the same level of access to this government help system, and that's a fantastic change that's definitely worth supporting. Now, on top of that, there are even going to be more scholarships available under this system for people from difficult backgrounds. And I think that this is propaganda, first of all, about hundreds of thousands of dollars. The fees aren't going to be that high. People
they will be, though, and even Andrew Norton, who wrote the review into the demand-driven system, agreed, and all the modelling that we've seen shows that we will see fees increase up to into the realm of hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Andrew Norton wrote a blog post today specifically saying that that's not going to happen. His estimates were much, much lower. But also on top of that, we have a responsibility to pay, and the actual evidence shows that people don't consider their fees before they start university. The help system is fantastic. It's world leading. It means that we only start paying when we actually start earning. So the decisions about whether or not to go to university are not based upon that figure that we will be paying when we earn a certain amount of money in our lifetime.
Matthew,
it will be quite high.
Can I ask you, there was one placard in Sydney today that said, "Hands off our hopes." That word, hope, hopes. Do you concede that many students and prospective students, future students hoping for a university degree at the moment feel as though this budget has curtailed, even killed their hopes?
Absolutely not. I think this.
But how could you say that? Why would otherwise they go onto the streets?
Well, I think the extreme left likes to oppose. They don't like to do a constructive political debate.
Matthew, on the weekend we saw tens of thousands of people protest not just against the higher education measures, but about opposing the attacks on universal health care. Pensioners were marching today in Melbourne. We've seen students from high schools come out. We've seen public servants come out. This isn't just the extreme left. There's clearly a broad opposition from the mainstream public to this budget, and particularly the higher education measures.
I'd like to just pick up, if I could, Deanna, while you're there. Matthew mentioned that there's been a lot of research into the fact that students don't look at the money that they're going to be spending before they go to university, they don't look at the fees. In your experience, do students look at how much their university degrees are going to cost them and how they're going to pay those degrees back?
They certainly do, but more to the point, the students we're talking about that most often look at the figures and look at what debt they're going to be saddled with are students from low SES and disadvantaged backgrounds. And suggesting that the problem of deregulation of fees is going to be solved because we'll have scholarships and bursaries offered by universities is ridiculous. You can't argue that a handful of scholarships and bursaries is going to make up for the massive increases in fees we'll see.
Matthew, when you said before that this gives hope, how do you see this as giving hope when so many feel as though it doesn't, and why they were on the streets? How does it give hope?
Well, it gives hope by giving more access to the help system. I mean, currently people who go to TAFE, a lot of them have to pay up front, they have to pay at the time. This opens up the help debt system to more people. And it doesn't really change the circumstances and the decisions that people make when they go to university. The reality is that people are making rational decisions about the kind of incomes that they're going to be earning throughout their lifetime.
But Matthew, do you really think that a student from an impoverished family would look at the potential of a $100,000 debt or a $150,000 debt in the same way that a student from a relatively privileged background would? Don't you think that they would look at that and go, is it worth it? I would argue that they would definitely be making, that would definitely put question marks over whether they do a degree or a double degree, whether they study at the University of Melbourne or the Victoria University. It definitely has an impact on students' decision making.
But Deanna, there are provisions for scholarships for help those who are financially disadvantaged. And it is, in effect, a loan where you only pay it back when you are passing over a certain threshold once you are earning money. Doesn't this provide for all to potentially get a tertiary education?
The scholarship scheme that the government is talking about is really a furphy.
Why do you say that?
Because what it's doing is putting the responsibility onto students themselves to fund what should really be the government's responsibility, which is ensuring that everyone, no matter where they come from, has the opportunity to access university. But the other thing is, as I said before, a handful of scholarships and bursaries to a few students isn't going to make up for massive escalations in student fees and student debt as a consequence. That it is not even going to come close to compensating for it.
Matthew, I'd just like to check in with you there in Melbourne. We're joined by Matthew Lesh in Melbourne. He's from the Australian Liberal Students Federation spokesman. Now, Matthew, just in the last hour or so, David Gonski has delivered a speech in Melbourne around looking into his report that he released a few years ago, and he did talk about basically making education an aspirational goal, that everyone could have access to it. Now, this is a gentleman charged with, over years, looking at the education system, going into public schools, going to private schools, making his assessment that education needed to be available to everyone, despite their socio-economic background. What would you say to David Gonski if you heard him give that speech tonight, and I guess to refute that, given that you see this as a hopeful budget for those trying to get an education?
Look, I think what you've just hit on there is actually high school education. And the reality is that the disparity in higher education comes from a senior school level. It comes from people not having high-quality senior schools. If you want to get more people from a disadvantaged background going to universities, it's really key to improve educational quality, to improve teachers at high school level in order to give people a greater opportunity. That's where the debate starts. Now, the debate also continues in the idea that people who don't go to university shouldn't be massively subsidising those who do. It's unfair that people who are privileged and have access to university education should have it subsidised by people who don't have access.
But let's not create a false dichotomy of students versus taxpayers. That's what the government's trying to do at the moment. I'm a taxpayer. I pay tax. I pay income tax. I pay GST. I pay a range of taxes. There's no students versus taxpayers, and arguing that there is a group of people out there that are too much funding the education of students out there isn't the case at all, especially when you look at international comparisons, and we're far below at least 20 countries in the OECD in terms of government investment.
Look, the reality is that 60% of taxpayers aren't going to get a higher education degree, and they shouldn't be forced with the shackles of subsidising our higher incomes in life.
Matthew Lesh there in Melbourne and Deanna Taylor here in Sydney. Thank you to you both for sharing your views and perspectives with us here tonight.